Hello and welcome to Paradigm Playbook, a podcast for entrepreneurs in the business of sports. Your hosts, Dave Kozak and Steve Cook, are business owners, successful entrepreneurs, sports enthusiasts, avid readers, and longtime friends. For years, they've read every business book on the market and built successful companies with what they've learned. This podcast will give you the critical takeaways in just 15 minutes a week. It's a quick and easy playbook for building a winning sports business. And now, here are your hosts, Dave and Steve.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Paradigm Playbooks podcast. I'm your host, Dave Kozak, alongside my co-host, Mr. Steve Cook.
Welcome.
Steve, what's the subject today?
We're going to talk about business expansion. And I think... So it's a little bit different than growth. I think expansion, we can go in a lot of different ways, but so you can talk about expanding geographically, adding locations, adding people, adding products, adding services. All those things are all part of expansion. But let's back up for a minute and talk about why expansion is important.
Yeah. So in my mind, while they're different subjects, growth and expansion, they're very interrelated to one another. And I think expansion is the idea that you can take on more, do more, or facilitate the growth that you're looking for, right? You don't always have to grow your singular product. You can get another product. Is the way I look at kind of the expansion. And between vertical and horizontal integrations, there's a lot of room for expansion. But you can also expand your ability to service more people with less. Like, there's a lot of different ways expansion comes in. It's not just this linear, hey, like growth to me is a I don't want to say it's a linear thing, but it's measurable that way.
So where do you go with, what's the opposite of expansion?
Contraction.
Okay, so then can we necessarily say, and I guess stagnation falls somewhere right in the middle of it. Well. But stagnation is either going to motivate expansion or cause contraction. Yeah. So I think the necessity of expansion is the sustenance of the business.
Yeah, and I think when you look at growth, I think there's always a very clear measurable in growth, which ends up going to the bottom line in some facet or another. Now, that's not the interpersonal growth. That's not the other types of growth there are. But when you're talking about business growth, usually it's measured by that bottom line. I think expansion doesn't always cause that type of growth, right? That would be the goal. And I think you're missing some of the mark if you're expanding and not generating additional revenue streams or sources. But I think I look at expansion as in hiring. I look at expansion as in new products, new services. I look at expansion as in expanding roles inside the organization. I think there is, and to stagnate is to set a shelf life, in my eyes, right?
Yeah, and we often talk about the good enough is never good enough. So let's take one type of expansion, and let's just say we're running a small business, entrepreneur running a small business, and we decide on geographical expansion. Yeah. So this is one way you can go. So what are the different ways you can, reach a larger geographic audience?
Well, in today's day and age, again, depending on the business you're running, depending on what the overhead expenses are, you have some unique opportunities of expansion that didn't exist 20 years ago. In the same right, if we're talking about athletic facilities, it's that second facility, right? And I think there's a real opportunity in opening the second because you learned a lot of lessons with the first, and hopefully you don't repeat those lessons and you can be more effective in setup, structure, and cost of the second. You also don't have all the barriers that you had in launching that first business. So use a perfect example, right? You run a shop and you have somebody in your shop who you've kind of trained along the way, and they have some managerial capabilities and they have the right tools. can they take 3 days of operation from you and operate while you're not there and you're out trying to expand the other side or a second facility?
So you make a great point in that maybe the first step in this expansion is to afford yourself the time to expand. And that's you personally as the entrepreneur, the owner of the business. If you don't have the time for an expansion, it's not going to happen just automatically. I think the mistake, let's stick with the second facility idea, because I see that, frequently in the sports business. And it doesn't mean just because you've done this, you can hire someone and say, here, you do what I did. And you always talk about processes. So if you haven't really written up your operating procedures, you don't have this quantified, then it's going to be hard to pass it on to someone else and say, here, you do this.
Yeah, and that goes back to many of the conversations we've had in the past, which is build your business as a franchise, right? If you build your business with the franchise model in mind, your standard operating procedures, your branding, all of the raw stuff to start a second one's already built. You don't have to do that again. You don't take on that expense again. You just implement. So now you become an implementor as opposed to a creator, right? And I think once you've implemented, you've created, you've defined, you've written out the processes, you've refined the process, you've gone through that learning curve, you now have the blueprint to go do it again.
So, but what if that's not where you started? I mean, so I see it all the time. We talk about the entrepreneurial seizure, and you're working for someone, say, I can do this better. I move on, and I'm going to just start my own place, and I do it, and I get into this for the freedom of being away from somewhere else. And it's not for 5 or 10 years that you start thinking about, okay, what's the next step? And again, if you don't expand, being tired will drag you down. So you have to be going towards something. So if you didn't start from the beginning as a franchise, as you suggested, how do you transition from, this is where I am now, I don't have any of this written down, but it's working, I'm just going to, how do you move forward?
I mean, I think there's a real project on your hands to take all of the things that you do well and to document them and to have that training manual ready, because you can't be two places at the same time, right? And if it's working well here, what is it that is working well and why is it working well? If you're not doing the reflection and the evaluation of why things are working well, is it the people? Do you have the perfect, group of people at that facility? Do you have all of the perfect processes? Is your client base just motivated and love what you do? Will that apply the same way to the next facility? I think you have to take that reflective approach to determine that, right? And if you haven't gone through the process to define all of those pieces, I don't think you're at the step where you can make a successful expansion, because you're starting at square one if you do it that way.
Okay, so I'm going to throw a second expansion in here on it. So we're not going to expand to a second location. We're going to expand the physical location we're in now, and we're going to market to an expanded audience. So what are the differences, the difficulties of one over the other?
Yes, and I think that one comes down to barriers to entry in whatever you're doing. I think it comes down to marketing, right? What is the audience that you're going to expand into? How motivated are they to act on this new facility, right? Well, you use Grand Slam as the example for a minute, right? Grand Slam's been a name in baseball for a long time. As a matter of fact, the name is a baseball analogy or correlation, right? Well, how do you go into basketball? Do people want to come to a facility named Grand Slam for basketball? We can use another local business in Sports Academy, or not Sports Academy, All-Star Baseball Academy. Yeah. It's now All-Star Sports, right? Why is it All-Star Sports? Because their expansion indicated that people didn't want to come to a baseball facility to practice lacrosse, right? So what are you doing to set it up for that expansion? Now, use another example. You've got 5 baseball facilities and nobody doing basketball training, right? Now you have a starving market. So your expansion into that market based on market research indicates, hey, if we put 4 courts in this side, we can, and we have set up a couple of leagues or a couple of coaches to do it. Now you have an opportunity because there is a lack of that service or product.
So if you were the original entrepreneur that started this business, whether it's All-Star or Grand Slam or whatever it is, theoretically you had the plan to launch. So do you look at that expansion as a second launch and say, okay, it's almost like we're starting a second business, but we're carrying we're cutting the overheads way down because, we're carrying some of those expenses by the original business?
I think you have to in some respects. If we go back to Stephen Covey's Begin with the End in Mind, right? Was expansion part of your original thought, or was it not?
Yeah, see, and I guess that's where I struggle, because I feel like in sports, with most of them, it's not.
Agreed.
And All-Star is a local example that they got into expansion really early in their existence, so they started building for that. So it worked. Our Grand Slam did expand and failed. So our Grand Slam, pre me buying the business, opened a second facility 20 miles away, tried to duplicate everything, didn't have the same owner, didn't have the exact same style, and failed. So I wasn't around, so I don't know exactly why it failed, but I do know that it failed.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting study too, where if you come back to what I had said previously about, do you have the right people? Do you have the standard operating procedures? Do you have a real defined way of doing things? And can you duplicate that? Is it something that is scalable that way, right? I'll use the example of my own company. So Elite Collegiate Planning and Paradigm Financial Group, at one point we had 3 locations pre-COVID. We had a location in Horsham, we had a location in Pottstown, and we had one in Chester Springs. And so our ability to meet people was expanded because geographically speaking, we had now a larger radius we could pull from, because you could go to whatever was convenient. If you needed to stay out in the Horsham area, hey, you could meet us at the Horsham office. Asking people to drive an hour and a half to meet us in Chester Springs wasn't viable. They weren't doing it. Well, COVID hits, and all of a sudden everybody Zooms or go-to meeting, everything. And so now we shut down those 2 outskirts offices because there was no reason for us to pay. People were not coming in person by force. They weren't allowed to come in person. So, and we've not seen a force back to having those locations.
So what's your, and I know you don't, drill down on traffic within your facility, but what is the traffic? What percentage of your customers are in-person meetings versus, online?
We're probably less than 50% in person now.
Really? And what was it prior?
95 to 100% in person.
Okay.
And I would say that some of it is convenience, some of it is by design, some of it is just a circumstantial, right? And the convenience piece is it's easier for people to block out an hour to have a consultation with us virtually. It's much harder for them to schedule 3 hours when they have to drive 45 minutes, be in a meeting for an hour and drive 45 minutes back.
So I think the drive time, pardon the pun, drives a lot of your decision making. In the sports world, you find that the acceptable drive time has a direct correlation to the age of the student. So the younger you are, the shorter the distance the parents are willing to drive. So they're looking, if you're going to go to a swim school, you have a 3-year-old, you're looking for something within 5 or 10 minutes.
Yep, convenience.
As you get older and you become a swimmer, and now you need to work on your competitive strokes, and you're in high school, you'll drive an hour. And if you get to be an elite athlete, you'll move across the country. So your stretch is controlled by, or your drive, your reach is controlled by the offering that you have. If you can't coach that Olympic athlete, you're not going to attract someone across the country.
Correct.
And I don't know if that, so in elite collegiate planning, is that something that can be scaled nationwide?
Well, yeah, we already have.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, just the marketing has changed tenfold in the last 3 years. It was always there, but you just didn't have to go there. Well, now you've really taken down territorial borders for a lot of things, right? Unless there's a physical presence required, you can pretty much be a national company right off the bat, right? Unless you need a physical presence of two humans to interact, you can do it. Now, what I will also say is, in the financial space, it's not as easy to move money for people virtually, right? You don't get the same bonding and rapport, the trust building, the knowing the individual as you do when you handshake and sit down across the table from them. But I also think culturally we're shunning that. We're not endorsing the handshake anymore. We're not endorsing people being face to face as much as I think it's necessary.
Yeah, and I'm pretty old school in that. So I believe that face-to-face is important. I believe, they were doing a study that, have you ever noticed in a basketball game, Niall, this is up your eye, we're talking basketball now, but after a made or missed foul shot, the players all slap hands. And there is a psychological unity building by touching. So that is not accidental. That is intentional. So you see that and you wonder why everybody does it. Why are you slapping hands when you just missed 2 foul shots that may cost us the game? It's because you need to make the next one. So those connections, you may not need it to make that first sale, but it will be instrumental in growing that relationship.
Well, yeah, and the tenure of the relationship manifests in that human one-to-one contact, right? You don't build any long-standing relationship that is valuable without a more intense interaction as time goes on, right? And so human touch is a natural component of that.
So in the sports business, we find the further reach you want, you have to add one of two things. You have to add either the level of the sport, or you have to attract in groups. So you will get a team that will travel if you're running a tournament. And now, we see it in baseball where, the whole team from our town here in Exton will travel to Aberdeen, Maryland for a tournament, and they don't think twice about a 2-hour drive. But if they all had to travel individually, it may be a little bit harder to attract, 15 kids to play on a team to come in there. So the Ripken Sports Complex runs their business on attracting teams, not individuals. Mm-hmm. So I think it changes how you expand, changes what you offer. Your products and services have to be different.
Yeah, and they have to match the market, right? That if I reflect back on my kind of knowledge of business, the one area that I don't want to say I underlooked, but I didn't place nearly as much importance on it as I should have, is the marketing. And not just the marketing, the market. And I don't mean the stock market. I mean the market of people that are willing to buy your goods and services and your touch points with those people. I always assume that a good business just gets clients because it's a good business. And that's just not the case. The message has to be delivered. And if COVID taught us anything, it taught us that people can really bubble up and stay in their bubbles. And so if you can't burst the bubble and get in there, you're not going to get the business. So how you reach people is vital too.
Yeah, we have a reality check, all the time at Grand Slam with people coming in and, they come to the counter and say, I've never been here. How does this work? Or, how do you pay? Or what is it? And They say, oh, you knew the area? And no, we've been here for 30 years. And I say, yeah, we've been here for 39 years and we've never crossed paths. So I think that happens. So I think marketing is key and maybe the first step in expansion that we should all look at. And write this down for a new podcast, but we got to dig into the storytelling mindset of marketing, which is different than running ads and even posting stuff. I think everybody's gotten a little bit too tied into social media and posting and not enough on the story that's getting out, the content.
Yeah, and I think there's a real birds of a feather mentality that you've got to pay attention to. Meaning if you need to look at the demographics of your area, really evaluate what makes a business successful and duplicate that elsewhere, right? Find that demographic, that same kind of motivation of client, and you'll do well in that expansion. But you can't take a product that sells to suburban America and take it urban and expect to have the same result.
No, I think you have to adjust it. I'm not saying you can't.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's not going. The same model is not going to apply.
So I had this conversation. I was speaking at a gymnastic club owners conference, and it came up, who do you market to? And the bright ones are all, we market to everybody that's possibly interested in gymnastics. We run gymnastics school. Anyone's possibly interested in gymnastics. And so my question was, but the rest of them is bigger. Why don't we, market to those that don't know gymnastics, are not interested, and get them interested.
Yeah.
So that's content. So the big thing in marketing now is attraction marketing, and we're talking about creating narratives that attract people to come to you. And it's kind of what happens with podcasts too. You start putting out content and people say, well, I got to, call that guy, ask him a question. And some of the consulting things that we come up with are people, I heard you talking about this. And, but I think you have to think about, take a really different perspective on your business to do this.
Yeah, without question. It's not, just because it was successful in this one bubble doesn't mean the expansion is easy.
Yeah. Before we run out of time, one other expansion possibility is the M&A world, which is huge right now. And you can expand your business by acquiring an inline business. It doesn't have to... you kind of did this with your business. Why don't you tell us about how you expanded from selling an idea to providing the service? Yeah,
so I had a need for a particular service offering, which is the college admission side, and so I found a company that aligned with what we did and how we did business, and was able to provide the services to us. And at some point, it became, well, hey, we're using it. We know it better than anybody else. Why don't we acquire it and we can take it to the next level? And so it was in line. We were doing business with them every day, and now it's in-house, and we're still doing business together every single day between our businesses. But the idea is now there's a control mechanism, there's a quality control mechanism, there's a expansion capability that we didn't have previously.
That's an ideal way to expand. I think you can almost reverse that and expand by being acquired and still consider it expansion. So you want to be part of something bigger. And sometimes it's better to be the third step in a huge company than the top step in a small one. So I think there's a lot to M&A, and we're finding out with the influx of cash available in today's marketplace that you have a lot of equity investors out there right now. As I go from trade show to trade show, which I never saw before, but you have, in the sports world, you have people offering all kinds of different products and services. And now we're seeing booths at the trade shows about equity investing groups that are all there trying to get to know people and saying, okay, how can I put 3 of these businesses? And if you go into my world and picture someone coming in overseeing this and say, well, Grand Slam's a little bit different than All-Star, but if I bought them both, maybe the synergy of the two is greater.
Mm-hmm.
So I think M&A is something that everybody should at least get to know a little bit about.
Yeah, without question. It can be, there's an old economic concept called Nash equilibrium. And Nash equilibrium is why typically when you see a McDonald's, you see a Wendy's. And when you see a McDonald's and a Wendy's, you see a Chick-fil-A or vice versa. Everybody's trying to feed off of one another, where there's satisfaction across all groups. So in economic game theory, right, if you were, and I'll use the simple expression that I think, or the simple illustration, say there's 9 beaches, mm-hmm. right? And on beach number 1, there's a Coke vendor, and on beach number 9, there's a Pepsi vendor. The idea is that everybody from beach 5 would go either way. But if you're at beach 4, 3, or 2, you go to Coke. And if you're at beach 6, 7, or 8, or 6, 7, 8, or 9, you go to Pepsi. Now, if both the Coke and Pepsi vendor went to beach number 5 next to each other, you'd get everybody from all beaches coming to one location. So in a family now, you could have 4 people that really don't like Coke, or 2 people that like Coke and 2 people like Pepsi, and both companies are more successful as a result of that, because you buy 2 Cokes and 2 Pepsis. Yeah. And so each company, it thrives in that regard. And so I think when you talk about the synergies of an organization, or the synergies of 2 external businesses coming together, can you satisfy more people in that model? And I think that's what you're looking for, is that equilibrium.
Yeah, it's the whole idea of expansion is interesting in so many ways. And I'll dig into one last thing that I think is kind of the impetus behind, or one of the impetus behind expansion, and that's your exit strategy. You mentioned Stephen Covey's begin with the end in mind, and mm-hmm. not everybody knows that, but at some point you start looking at your exit strategy, and whether you want to sell out to cash out, or you want to expand for legacy, or you have a purpose driven, you want to reach more, in our business, more kids, more families. They're all good things, but to exit the business, you want to walk away with, a legacy, a memory, or cash. Yeah. It's all good. And sometimes it's not a matter of expanding your top line, but expanding your bottom line. Mm-hmm. And we can dig into, I think a fascinating topic that we maybe would dig into next week is price structure, mm-hmm. and how that affects expansion. Because sometimes, there's so many businesses that compete based on what their worst competitor is doing. Yeah. I think you got to get out of that mindset. So let's put it on the list to dig into pricing at some time.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, I think that wraps up today, Steve.
Yeah, I love it. And, almost every business is looking at or in the process of expansion. So if we can help you with any of that, please contact us.
Absolutely. All right, guys, it's been Paradigm Playbook.
Make it a great day.